global warming real? Is climate change irreversible? Why are carbon emissions still rising? Join host Dr. Alberto Troccoli, a global leader in climate science and its application to the energy sector, as he unpacks these pressing issues. Through candid conversations with leading experts, get ready to demystify climate change and explore its many layers. So, let's communicate!
We're often told that climate change could devastate the global economy. But how large are the damages from warming, really? And how uncertain are those estimates? Hello, I'm Alberto Troccoli, and this is Let's Communicate. Today, I'm joined by Professor Richard Tol, climate economist, contributor to multiple International Panel for Climate Change, or IPCC reports, and one of the most debated voices in climate policy. We'll discuss climate risk, adaptation limits, economic modeling, and what the debate still gets wrong. Richard, before we dive into these topics, how do you introduce yourself in a conversation this charged? And what first drew you into climate economics?
I usually just introduce myself. People know who I am, usually. I got into the economics of climate change more or less by accident. I'm actually trained as a statistician more than as an economist. But the place where I worked did not really have budgets to support somebody working on the statistics of climate change. So I was sort of ushered into working on the economics of climate change. The first job was essentially to replicate what Bill Nordhaus had done.
Excellent. So you worked directly with Will Nordhaus, I understand.
Nordhaus was the external on my PhD.
So Nordhaus, for our listeners, is a Nobel Prize winner for economics a few years ago, and on the issue of climate change. And we'll mention some of his work during the conversation today. And so welcome, Richard. Before we start, because Let's Communicate, we talk with people from different angles of the climate change debate. We like to ask 4 quick fire questions just to get a bit of bearing on where our guests stand on the topic of climate change. So the first question is really simple, but how much has the global temperature changed in the past 150 years in degrees Celsius?
People disagree on the exact numbers, but something like 1.1, 1.2 degrees Celsius warming.
And what percentage of this change is due to human-induced greenhouse gases?
Again, people disagree, but I think it's somewhere between 90 and 120%.
That's your view?
Yes. Well, it's not my view. That's what I read in the literature. Right? This is not an active point of research of myself.
So the third question is, what's your best estimate for the global temperature change over the next 50 or 80 years, let's say to 2100, again in centigrade?
I think we're looking at 2.5 to 3, maybe 3.5 degrees of warming by 2100.
And lastly, maybe this is a bit more complex, but we just want to hear a little bit your position on this. What's your assessment of the risk, let's say in percentage, that the climate tipping point will be triggered by 2100? Thermal highland circulation or the thawing of methane, the permafrost?
Well, that's a question that cannot be answered, right? Because there's multiple so-called tipping points, and there's many things that people call tipping points that aren't really tipping points. And the probability depends on where exactly you draw the line. I don't think this is a useful question to ask or answer.
Wonderful. So let's get into the discussion on your topic of your expertise. So you worked on climate economics for decades and contributed to many reports of the IPCC, as we said before. When you look at today's climate debate, what do you think people misunderstand most about the economic side of climate change?
That's a very broad question. The thing that bugs me after all these years is the predominance of the Nordhaus framework over the Schelling framework. So what Nordhaus did is essentially what you would do in a laboratory experiment. You change one variable and you see what happens, right? And that's a perfectly sound way of doing a controlled experiment. But of course, that is not what the future will be like. So to make it more concrete, essentially what most people assume in the economics of climate change is that climate will change, but society will remain as it is today. It may be a little bit larger, but it's not structurally different than today. So the impacts of climate change are typically assumed to be a function of climate change and climate change only, which is just complete nonsense because everything will change. And that leads to very peculiar assumptions, very peculiar results. Perhaps the most striking result can be found in the Stern Review of 2006, where they had a reasonably pessimistic scenario of greenhouse gas emissions into the future. And the only way you could get emissions that high if a lot of people in Africa would be driving big SUVs with internal combustion engines. That is how you could get emissions that high. And those things are expensive, right? So that assumes that people are rich enough to buy SUV.
So we're talking about the RCP 8585.
That's equivalent before that. The RCPs weren't around at the time, but it was something similar.
Right.
At the same time, they assumed that people were too poor to buy bed nets to protect their children against malaria, which is a very strange combination of assumptions. It's a very perverse set of preferences that people have. I'd rather have a car than healthy children. I don't think that there's many people who think like that. And that sort of goes to the core of what I'm trying to say here, that there are things that are happening in society that could make us more vulnerable to climate change, but actually most of the trends are to become less vulnerable to climate change. And as soon as you introduce that into your integrated assessment model or your damage function or your estimate of the social cost of carbon, those numbers fall quite fast and quite dramatically. And that is still by and large overlooked. And the reason that I say decades is because actually it was in 1984, that Tom Schelling wrote this up in a paper and said, well, society is not constant. The things that we worry about now may not be the things that we worry about in 20 years' time or in 80 years' time. Examples of people worried about the big cities of the world being covered in horse shit, because how otherwise could you transport all these people that were projected to be there? This was because people did not imagine the invention of the car, right? And that sort of attitude, that sort of simplistic way of thinking about how systems will change is still, unfortunately, prevalent in not just the economics of climate change, but actually most of the literature on the impacts of climate change, not just in the economics discipline, but in other disciplines as well.
So that's, thanks, Richard. This is a very good framing, and it shows that it's quite complex. And I guess, we'll dive into some of the aspects you mentioned, the integrated assessment models and assumptions that are made on the models and so on. But it will be good to have a sense at the end of all these assumptions that are made to arrive to what is actually estimated the cost of climate change by 2100, given all these complexities. And you would think that it's actually, it is a very tricky thing, but and so it's we can see the numbers, but we need to understand what the assumptions are behind before we take any conclusion or decisions. So before we go into that more technical discussion, this was like an opening framing. We like to go back to one of your work. I don't know if you would regard this as one of your major paper about the climate niche of Homo sapiens. So in 2024, Maybe it's recent. I know you published so much, and this may be just one of the many. So you talked about the climate niche for humanity. And what does this actually mean, the climate niche? And how does it help the debate from abstract global averages towards the questions about where people can realistically live and thrive? Is it a useful alternative framing to just looking at 1.5 degree or 2 degrees?
No, I would not say that. And this paper was essentially a reaction to an earlier paper written by people who can, I think, you best described as climate alarmists. So what they did in that paper was figure out what is the livable space for humans and what sort of climates could humans survive. Which is a reasonable question to ask because there's obviously biophysical limits to what our bodies can and cannot stand. So I think it's a useful question to ask. The answer that they came up with was very peculiar. So essentially what they assumed, they looked at the relationship between where people live and what is the climate in those places, and then they tried to find sort of what is the boundary. But they made a very peculiar assumption that 10% of the current world population lives in places that are unlivable. And that's actually a very strange sentence to even say, that 10% of the people live in places where you cannot live, because they obviously do, right? Unless you assume that they're all zombies, but I don't think that is a reasonable assumption.
Right.
So that paper essentially started with, this is a ridiculous result. And how can we do this better? The strange thing about this paper is actually that these people who wrote the original paper, there's biologists among them. But the methods that I use in this paper are actually developed in biology. That is, how do you find the ecological niche of any species? That gets into fairly technical extreme value statistics. We won't go into that here. The key finding of this paper, there's a couple of findings in the paper, but one of the more striking ones is that if you look at the distribution of the human population across, not across space, but across climate, then we actually seem to be hugging the upper limit of the temperature. There's lots and lots of places, lots and lots of people who live in really hot places. And just extrapolating from that, say there's no reason to assume that if there had been hotter places on the planet, then we would have lived there too, because it's not that sort of population density thins close to the thermal limit of the observed temperature. It thickens at that point. It seems that people seem to be actively moving towards climates that are as hot as available on this planet, right? On the cold side, you see actually the exact opposite. There, the population really thins. There's very few people who live in really cold places, where it's very scarce, very low population densities. So if you just look at these statistics, then it strongly suggests that we are a species that hates the cold and loves the heat. Which sort of casts doubt on everything we say about climate change is terribly dangerous. And we will see large numbers of dead people because of climate change.
Right. So I guess there are 2 points to this. There is a question that you could consider that the first humanoids, our progenitors, actually came from Africa, from East Africa, and we don't know exactly what the temperature was like to something million years ago there, but we could assume that it was pretty high. So they were living fine. They were in warm climates. But at the same time, there are also places that we know that they can, even today, can reach close to 50 degrees centigrade, and people don't live there. People don't live in deserts, and so we know that there are places with extreme high temperatures, but they're not livable. So there are some ranges.
That is actually a bit of a myth. So there is this famous valley. I actually forget where it is, somewhere in the west of the United States, called Death Valley, right?
Yeah.
And the reason it's called Death Valley is because stupid white men can't cross that without dying. But at the same time, American Indians have lived there for centuries. So what is Death Valley to some people is actually just a normal livelihood to others. You're absolutely right that originally we're at the very least a subtropical species. It's also true that there are real biophysical limits to the amount of heat we can take. And that has just been established by biologists and physiologists. If it's dry heat, we can take up to 55 degrees Celsius. But if you go to 100% humidity, then the temperature that our body can stand falls to 35 degrees Celsius. And above that, your body starts to deteriorate. And if you stay in such conditions long enough, then eventually your internal organs will fail first and you will die.
But the key is long enough, though, because
exactly.
You can stay in 50 degrees for 3 seconds, but if you stay for 3 days, maybe that's not good enough.
It's a matter of exhaustion, right?
Exactly.
Your body has to work harder and harder to keep yourself cool. The trick is to keep your core temperature at 37 degrees, right? So the hotter it gets, the harder you need to work to do so. So you may die of exhaustion, depending on how well your lungs and your heart work, right? Some people keep this up for hours, other people keep this up for days. So, I mean, that is fairly well established. Now, a couple of years ago, there was this piece in The Guardian, an English newspaper, which was a journalist who had traveled to Yaqobabad, which is in Pakistan, during a heat wave. And this journalist believed a lot what this more simple climate models, climate impact models would tell you, namely that if it's 55 degrees, even dry heat, then 55 degrees dry heat, and it was very close to that, then people will die, right? So this journalist traveled to Yaqobabad in the expectation of finding bodies piled up in the street. But that was not what he found. What he found was that people there, it's not the first time that this happens. They were actually fairly clever in how to deal with this. So major changes in behavior during heat waves, but also very clever use of microclimates. And few people actually pay close attention to this. If you have a thermometer in your car, you can actually see it, that sometimes you drive a few hundred meters and the temperature drops or rises by 2 degrees or 3 degrees, right? If you walk through the house or around the house, then actually you experience pretty stark differences in temperature, depending on whether you're on the south side of the house or the north side, in the shade or in the sun. There's actually always microclimates around you that are cooler than the prevailing temperature in summer. In winter, you of course look for the warmer spots. And what this journalist found in Yaqobabad is that people were just very cleverly making use of the microclimates to make sure that their bodies were not exposed to what are really deadly temperatures. And the assumption in a lot of this literature is the temperature is uniform, that if sort of in a grid cell, it says 50 degrees, then at every spot in this 50 by 50 kilometer cell, it's 50 degrees, which is just not true. And these models also assume that people are passive and let bad things happen to them, rather than that people are active and work hard to avoid negative consequences for themselves.
Yeah, I would just like to ask you how you summarize this. I mean, what is the actual conclusion out of the studies of people that can live at the edge of the high end of warmth? Considering also that, I mean, I can hear what you're saying about the people who can sustain some high temperatures, but at the same time, if we take the example of the famous 2003 heat wave in Europe, it's been estimated there were 50 or 60,000 excess deaths. So these are obviously premature deaths. So, I mean, we can sustain some temperatures, but even in civilized and, the well-developed countries, there are deaths for heat.
Oh, absolutely. I'm not saying that climate change will not bring hardship and will not bring death. The 2003 heat wave in France and a few neighboring countries is actually a very good example of what I'm talking about. So you're absolutely right that tens of thousands of people, and we're not quite sure how many exactly, but tens of thousands, people died in August 2003 because of heat exposure, right? Simple as that. The reasons for this was mostly because the French health service was on holiday. So there was simply no medical support for all these people. That is the main reason. For reasons I do not fully understand, the responsible minister has not been charged with multiple mass murder or genocide even, but he's just enjoying his pension. But it was essentially a system failure. The problem was that all the nurses and all the doctors were on holiday, and had they been at work, we would have seen maybe 10,000 deaths rather than 40,000 or 60,000. Now, what we have seen since 2003 are a number of comparable heat waves in Europe, but no comparable death numbers. And you could sort of say, well, the heat wave that came shortly after the 2003 one, all the vulnerable people were dead, so there was nobody left to kill. But that is not true for the heat waves in the 2020s and in the later of the 2010s. Really, what one of the people across Europe looked at the experience of France, figured out what really went wrong there, and said, this is not going to happen to us. And in France, this is not going to happen to us again. And what we've seen throughout Europe is that now the health services in the respective countries have heat plans that seem to be effective, because we have not seen similar number of deaths in Europe, even though we have seen similar heat in Europe. And people seem to have learned from this tragic event, right?
Well, it could be, yeah, certainly lessons learned is important, but what about also air conditioning? Because, for example, in Italy, there's been a surge of air conditioning unit around that time. So it's pretty clear, from the electricity consumption, there's a big change. And in France, probably similar. So I think a lot of this can be managed now through air conditioning as well.
That is actually one of the things that is, it's not just that the public sector responded, although they have, right? And I mean, whenever 20 years ago, 25 years ago, whenever there was a heat wave, there wasn't any sort of media campaign. There wasn't sort of any official response. It was not that the health service was put on high alert. It was not that nurses and doctors were called back from holidays. Nowadays they are. So there's also been clearly a public response. But you're absolutely right that private responses, particularly air conditioning, are now much more prevalent in Europe, particularly in Southern Europe, than they were 25 years ago. And that is, of course, an adaptation to climate change, people protecting themselves. You also see not just in private homes, but also more buildings, sort of public buildings, particularly in Southern Europe, are now air conditioned. And whereas previously the air conditioned public buildings were not freely accessible during heat waves. And they are now sort of functioning as cold banks, that people who cannot afford private air conditioning are allowed into these public buildings, even though they have no other business there than to keep cool. And that is another form of a public response to these heat waves.
Absolutely.
So we learned many lessons from the 2003 heat wave. Right?
Absolutely. In order to address the climate change, of course, we haven't said it, but there are the two main paths are adaptation and mitigation. So we are talking now about adaptation. And hopefully we won't end up in a situation where all the shopping malls will be full because, there is not enough air conditioning or there's too many heat waves or so on. But let's remain on the adaptation for a minute. And many people say that humans are adaptable, and we discussed now, some example of that, and we'll just adjust. So that could be seen as a way to say, we don't need to mitigate for climate change. So based on your research, where do you see genuine limits to adaptation, especially for, let's say now talk about a wider economic sector like agriculture or in densely populated regions?
I am not sure that there are limits to adaptation. I don't think that's it. It very much depends on the particular economic activity or the particular sector or system you're looking at. And it depends very much on circumstances. And the question is, of course, what is a limit to adaptation? If you talk to an ecologist, then they would say that death is a form of adaptation. And that may be the limit, right? And that is not a useful discussion. What is clear is that there are situations where you say, well, it's not worth staying here, and it's better if I move somewhere else. And migration is, of course, also a form of adaptation, right? And it is clear that if the world would get substantially warmer, then there would be places that are perhaps livable, right? But just not worth the expense of, it may just be very uncomfortable or very expensive to live there. So people would choose to move elsewhere. That is definitely on the cards, right?
Thank you for joining me on Let's Communicate today. Part 1 of my conversation with Professor Richard Tol has been insightful, and I hope you find it as engaging as I did. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with your network. Your support helps these important conversations reach further. In part 2 of our conversation, we dive into meta-analysis, about climate policy, and why Richard Tol is surprisingly optimistic about the future. So make sure you don't miss it. Until next time, let's keep communicating.